Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. It's Thursday, the 8th of January. As everybody knows in publishing, timing is everything. You write a book one week, it dies the next week. There's a huge news story and it becomes a bestseller. And that's certainly the case with Kenneth Rosen's new book, which came out this week. It's called Polar War, Submarine Spies and the Struggle for Power in a Melting Arctic. I wonder if, Ken, you did a deal with Donald Trump. Did you suggest to him that he invaded Greenland the week your new book came out?
Absolutely not. But it's good to see you again, Andrew.
It certainly is, Ken. And I was astonished. You were back on the show. You were on the show about 5 years ago, and we talked about the failed promise of behavioral treatment programs for troubled teens. You had a very well-reviewed book out back then called Troubled, The Failed Promise of America's Behavioral Treatment. It was about your struggle and everybody's struggle to grow up in America. How did you get from that? How did you get from Troubled to Polar War?
Well, I had been covering conflicts in the interim, and Troubled had started out as what was supposed to be a memoir about my time in these programs, but I ended up flipping the lens outward and focusing on the stories of 5 other people who went through those programs to do an investigation into the troubled teen industry. But while I was reporting that book, I was covering conflicts in Syria and Iraq and Palestine and Israel, and that was my primary focus. So the first book, Bulletproof Vest, was I guess a testament to that trajectory. And if you want to tie it all in somehow, not with a very neat knot, but tie it in by saying they're all sort of conflicts pertaining to America.
Yeah, to put it mildly. The book, as I said, it came out a couple of days ago. It's already #1 in Arctic ecosystems on Amazon. So congratulations on that. I'm not sure how much competition you have on books on Arctic ecosystems.
I wouldn't put much cachet into the Amazon algorithms. We don't know if it's book sales or page views, and they have a litany of different subgenres that I don't really know apply to the books. Arctic.
So in all seriousness, though, Ken, it's quite an achievement. How long did you spend in the Arctic? I know the book is based on a lot of first-person reporting.
I traveled to and from the Arctic for about 3 years. I spent a month in Iceland, more than a month in Alaska, and then did trips back and forth to all the different Scandinavian countries in the Arctic. It was a long few years, but my family pulled through. They supported me all the way, and turned out to be a wonderful experience, both for me and for what I learned.
How much of it was political? You've written a number of pieces about the battle for the Arctic. Obviously, that's very relevant this week. But was the book, or is the book, focused more on the new geostrategic rivalries in the Arctic, or more about the peoples there, the environment? What's the thing linking everything in Polar War?
It's about the dual impacts of climate change and geopolitics and how that's affecting the people in the North, but more importantly, how that residual effect will impact the rest of us. I was primarily frustrated in my initial research to find that most of the literature on the Arctic was about climate change and polar bears and the fauna and different peoples who lived across the high north, circumpolar north. And I wanted to understand how the defensive postures of these countries were impacting those people, those habitats, and how that would then translate to complications for the rest of us.
So what's the value? Everyone's asking themselves the value of Greenland, the value of the Arctic from Trump's point of view. Is it rare earth minerals? Is it geostrategic issues? Is it America's defense of its north? What's the key thing driving this massive sensitivity now of the Arctic North?
Well, I can't speak for President Trump's mentality or what his thinking is. It seems to me that he may want Greenland for its natural resources for its rare earth minerals, cobalt, iron, silicone, all the things that we rely on in our defense and energy industries. But as far as a security standpoint goes, the Americans already possess a base in northeastern Greenland, the Pacific Space Base, and we've had that space base since the end of World War II through the Cold War, and it's our northernmost base. So as far as security goes, I think perhaps we could bolster it with better equipment and more surveillance technologies, but the security of Greenland is already well established through the Kingdom of Denmark and the American presence there.
We did actually a show on Greenland a couple of years ago with a writer, Elizabeth Buchanan. She had a book out back then called So You Want to Own Greenland, Lessons from the Vikings to Trump. She was actually reasonably, I'm not sure where she is right now on Trump and Greenland, but she was quite sympathetic to Trump's policy there and critical of the Danes, particularly their perhaps colonial aspirations in Greenland. Is there a European colonial legacy in the Arctic that you found, Ken?
Yeah, absolutely. The Kingdom of Denmark once possessed power and sovereignty over Iceland as well. I mean, today it also counts the Faroe Islands and Greenland as part of its territory. That's a legacy that they're still reckoning with today. The Kingdom of Denmark is continuously paying reparations to the Inuit population, the Greenlanders, for a number of severe and troubling instances over the last century. So the colonialism aspect remains, and it's something that they're reckoning with day to day. And on top of it now, they're reckoning with the fact that America is trying to use that as a toehold into its territory.
Yeah, the Danes aren't quite as good as they're always presented as, particularly on this show. What was your sense in terms of traveling around and talking to the locals in Arctic about the US and Trump and American ambitions? Was there an ambivalence or hostility, or is it hard to generalize?
I would say ambivalence is probably a great way of characterizing it. Most of the military forces that I traveled with in Scandinavia, the Swedish Armed Forces, the Norwegian border guards, and the Finnish border guards as well, felt that the Americans lacked the capabilities, and gave me numerous instances of times when the Americans would come to train and show their total ineptitude in Arctic and cold weather warfare. One example that was shared to me from the Swedish Armed Forces was how a special operations unit came out to train in a above the Arctic Circle in Arctic Sweden, and went out for a ski patrol without their shirts on. It was, below freezing, and so they felt like that was an okay thing to do, only to return a few hours later completely sunburned, because there's still sun, and the sun also reflects off the snow, making it twice as bad.
Yeah, I can imagine that was a brutal kind of sunburn as well.
Yeah, but I think things like that just underscore, and some early reviews and commentary on the book have said that I was extremely or potentially too harsh on American forces, and I want to note that I was definitely pointing out the naivety and difficulties that are facing American troops and service members in the high north who are operating in Alaska or northern Norway or what have you, to simply show that we can do better, that we need to do better, that this is an opportunity that we've lost as a nation. We once maintained great competency in the high north, and since the end of the Cold War, we've let it atrophy. I only point out these things in the hopes that my country will prosper again in areas where it once did.
You talk about your country, Ken. I know you spent some of the last few years living in Italy with your family. Some of the early reviews of the book have been criticized from perhaps a MAGA nationalist position. Do you think that this kind of book and this kind of subject in America's current environment can get a fair hearing?
What do you mean a MAGA nationalist environment? I haven't read those reviews.
Oh, well, you said that you got some criticism for being too harsh on the Americans.
I think there was one review that I'm referring to in particular. And I know that when I was writing the book, some of the discussions I had with my editor were, am I being too tough on the Americans? And I know that in discussions I had pre-publication with Coast Guard officials, that I was underscoring the fact that I am going to be hard and critical of, constructively critical of American forces, if only to point out the failings of our country and where we can do better. And, to Trump's credit, he has started to put more emphasis on Arctic security cutters, signing a deal post-Biden. Biden had started an ice pact with Finland to create and build more icebreakers and ice-faring ships for the U.S., and Trump has doubled down on that. So there are some positives that are coming out of realizing that we weren't doing well enough, but it can continue to grow and maybe one day be on parity with where our Scandinavian allies are.
So much has happened, Ken, over the last few weeks. I mean, over the last few days, really. Venezuela, now Greenland. Is this the new world that's coming into being, the new geostrategic world that you glimpsed or half imagined before writing Polar War? Is this the new reality? You talked about a post-Cold War age.
I was fearsome of a post-world order phase of our planet, but I didn't think that the impetus for it would be the president of the United States. I thought it would be the president of the Russian Federation or of the Communist Party of China, the People's Republic of China. So that I foresaw. I just didn't foresee where it was coming from, I think. And if you recall 5 years ago, before we spoke also, I mean, the start of the year in the Trump administration was similarly chaotic with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. So maybe this is just the way to start a new year when you're under the Trump administration.
All sorts of speculative articles recently about new geostrategic alliances. One piece asks whether Trump's threat to Greenland will bring China and Europe closer together. Is this a four-power race for domination, Ken? Russia, China, Europe, and America? Is that one way of thinking of it? Almost like another scramble for Africa, only a scramble for the Arctic?
In some ways, I think from the American storyline, it's a matter of re-engaging with a region that it had neglected. The European storyline is to shore up defenses against a more hostile neighbor, Russia, and China seeking to benefit from that dissolution of cooperation within the High North. I don't think that China and Russia can gain a foothold in Greenland. The conversations that I had with Greenlanders were about how they would like more commerce. They want to develop their tourism industries. They want to develop their fishery capabilities, improve their defenses marginally because they don't feel as though they're under threat. And they want to do business with China and Russia in the ways that the rest of the world does business with China and Russia. But they don't want to see full-on investment from Chinese companies or Chinese mines or Russian mines. In fact, the Kingdom of Denmark has done a great job at keeping those lines of attack out of the country. I mean, we think of the efforts of China in Africa and trying to establish rail lines and then dumping long-term loans that can never be repaid on those countries. China tried to do the same with an airport in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, and Denmark stepped in to help fund it so that wouldn't end up happening. So I think there's some positive realities and acceptance of those maneuverings happening in the Arctic, and also the defense against those maneuvers in the Arctic.
So what do you want people to take away from this book, particularly given the newsworthiness of a book that took a long time to report? Next week or next month, there'll probably be other headlines. What are the core messages in this new book, Polar War?
I think the core message is that climate change is indeed a problem, but it goes beyond just melting icebergs and glaciers and polar bears dying off and becoming extinct. It impacts the security not only of the indigenous communities who live on the shorelines and within Arctic territories across the world, but also the rest of us. That when the climate starts to deteriorate, things like military incursions and exploratory drilling that could lead to disastrous ecological collapse are happening more frequently. And that's what we should be thinking of, these long-term horizontal effects of the planet's deterioration.
I'm guessing that if Donald Trump's watching this, I've heard he enjoys this show, he wouldn't agree because he would claim that climate change is a myth. Is it self-evident for people? You've spent a lot of time in the Arctic. If even Donald Trump was taken on a tour, maybe a dog sleigh tour of where you went in the Arctic, would it be self-evident that climate change is the new reality, Ken?
I don't think at this juncture today, Thursday, he'd be welcome on the dog sled in Greenland with the serious patrol. Maybe in a couple of weeks if the tensions die down. I think his rhetoric, maybe unbeknownst to him, about Greenland is precisely predicated on climate change. What he is essentially saying, by virtue of saying we need Greenland, is that yes, the planet is heating up, this region is getting hotter, and that is revealing more opportunities for natural resource extraction and for defensive projects. So maybe he won't say it outright that climate change is real, but what he's doing in order to secure some of the products of that warming planet are certainly underscoring that climate change is real.
So if you were in charge of American foreign policy when it comes to the Arctic region, what would you do? What would you recommend to Trump?
Oh, man. Andrew, what the heck? Big question.
Maybe you need to put your baseball cap on for that one.
Yeah. No, my thinking cap. Look, Andrew, I mean, I am a proponent of focusing on domestic issues. As you mentioned earlier, I lived overseas for 5 years. I've also traveled widely, and I've seen how others are living. If we're focusing on the Arctic, there is plenty of infrastructure projects, solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric, that can be undertaken in the Arctic to not only benefit the people of Alaska, but to benefit the rest of the country. And those are efforts and opportunities that I feel are not being looked upon by the Trump administration. Furthermore, there's been talk of Trump's Golden Dome. There's already a project underway in Canada to reevaluate and redevelop what was once the DEW line, the Northern Defense Line, that was built during the Cold War. Things like that are wholly focused on the defense of the people and also beneficial to the economies of Canada and America are something that we should be focused on. We should also finally focus on working with our partners who have the capabilities and the competency in the region, whether that be Norway or Sweden or Finland, who are now NATO members, to learn from them and to not take a primary role in the defense of those countries, but to take a secondary, more supportive role of those countries. Working together in the Arctic is a known entity and known quantity of living in the high north. You rely on your neighbors and your neighbors rely on you. And the moment that communication and cooperation breaks down, you end up in a really dark and lonely place. And I think that's where we're headed and where we should steer away from.
The book is also a travelogue. Actually, this time last year, I was in the Antarctic. It's very beautiful too. How classically beautiful is the Arctic, Ken, at its best, in terms of its silence, its vistas, its beauty? How would you summarize the experience outside politics and geostrategy?
Staggering. I mean, I remember I was sent out on a magazine assignment, which was the start of the book, what would become the book, to Svalbard to spend 2 weeks there reporting on similar issues. And I came back to Italy, and the first thing I told my wife was, how cool would it be if I got to write a book about the Arctic? I mean, I'm a guy who really likes the cold. Give me the snow over a beach any day of the year. The silence and the vistas are staggering, and I hope that I pay some tribute to it in the book with the writing to underscore that. But it's not the only part of the Arctic. There's a lot more underneath the surface, and I take some effort in the book to point out that people do just come to the region for that very reason, for the postcard vistas and the fun experiences of sled dogging or eating reindeer sausage. But there's a lot more going on underneath the surface, and I think that's what's most interesting.
There's a long history, of course, of Western explorers in the polar regions and Antarctic, Shackleton and so on. You're obviously not Ernest Shackleton, but do you see yourself in terms of this project as in that tradition?
Absolutely not. And I think within the first 2 paragraphs of the book, I mentioned that today, to do a journey similar to what Robert Peary did, or any of the other foreign explorers who were up there, it takes me $500 on a plane ticket in 2 hours. there's some complications and there's difficulties to life in the Arctic. Air Greenland costs so much per ticket because they have to build in the price of the hotels and the lodging and the food of the guests who get stranded when the weather turns poorly on those itineraries. So there are still some complications, but it's nowhere near what all those great explorers that came in the 20th century and the late 19th century had suffered through.
What's the worst possible scenario, Ken, for this? I mean, leaving aside war, as there's more and more interest in the polar area, as more and more tourists go there, as your book will no doubt trigger all sorts of other books and investigations and news articles, what do you most fear about the life in the Arctic, in the polar region, beyond war, in the next few years, as it becomes more central in how we all think about the future of the planet?
Well, first, I worry most about the indigenous communities and their ways of life. This is the sustenance lifestyle that will be eradicated, and something that we'll lose as a country and as humanity. Our connection to the land and our understanding of the land, and the way we could learn from indigenous communities who are working to adapt to climate change, things that we can take from those lessons. Secondarily, I worry now today about the dissolution of NATO. It's more than just a defense pact. It's really a community of nations that rely on each other for a lot more than just defense. And with that, it's been under threat for several years now, from the first Trump administration to this one. And I worry that, having traveled through Europe, having seen how much American defense postures are protecting Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, how much they rely on that until they can secure their own defense, there can't be a dissolution of NATO. I mean, we have family out there that would be lost if there was another war in Europe. So those are the two things that I worry about most. And whether or not my children will have the opportunity to see some of the beautiful landscapes that I got to see is neither here nor there. It's only a matter of time before the snow and the ice melts forever.
And how do we protect, the West or the great powers, how do we protect the lives and cultures of the indigenous people?
One of the criticisms I have in the book is that we have something like 30% of the seafloor mapped off the coast of Alaska. We need to do more to understand the changes that are occurring, and that also bodes well with needing more scientific cooperation in the North. I take a chapter in the book to note that Russia is the largest stakeholder by land and by coastline in the Arctic, yet we have severed all communication and scientific ties with that community. And there with it goes the puzzle piece, the largest puzzle piece in the Arctic, to understanding what's going on up there. As permafrost thaws and melts, it's also releasing a ton of carbon, which is only accelerating the process. And not being able to communicate with those communities, not going to those communities and trying to learn how they're managing and how they're reacting and what we can do to support them, we'll lose land, and we'll lose the people who live upon it.
I know the book features Russian spies. Most books about international geostrategic issues, of course, do. But can the Russians bring some wisdom which perhaps Americans lack, given the intimacy with which the Russian Empire knows, if not the Arctic region, certainly the polar north in much more experience than the United States?
Certainly. I mean, during World War II, we failed at operating up in northern Russia. The Atlantic defense during World War II was predicated on the coastline, or situated on the coastline of northern Norway. They have the experience and the knowledge to be able to operate there. And that was one of the benefits of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was to learn more about that region and that country and how they operated in such harsh conditions. And now we're without it. Go back to Napoleon, right? Trying to get to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And you can see that there's a long history and knowledge there that we're missing out on if we continue to keep them away from the Arctic Russia away from the Arctic Council, and that's a shame.
It's interesting you bring up Napoleon. Of course, Napoleon and Hitler always seem to be at the back of Vladimir Putin's mind when he thinks about Russia. And that certainly explains in part, although it doesn't justify his invasion of Ukraine. When Putin, I know it's hard to get into Putin's head as it is to get into Xi or Trump's head. But when Putin thinks of the Arctic, of the polar areas, Ken, the Ukrainian light bulb doesn't go off, does it? He doesn't think, well, this should be Russia. He doesn't think in nostalgic terms about the Soviet Union. What occurs to him? Does he give it any thought?
Does he give thought to the Arctic region as something that should be part of Russia?
Well, given his clear and unambiguous nostalgia for the Soviet Union, his attempt to put it back together again with the invasion of Ukraine and many other policies, how does the Arctic fit into Putin's geostrategic vision, his ambition of Russia in the 21st century?
I characterize it in the book as a discombobulation, right? We want everything always, all the time, all places. And maybe one of them will stick, right? I took the chapter to try to explore my failings as a Western thinker, to try to understand what a Soviet era or Eastern thinker might view as potential for the Arctic and Ukraine and all these other things that don't seem to make sense to us. But we can't forget also that the Arctic is a launch pad for many of the drone strikes in Ukraine. So I think if Putin views the Arctic as essential to securing Eastern Europe and that buffer zone that he claims is what Ukraine should become, then there's no stopping the growth and outcropping attacks into, say, Svalbard or Finland, which they are continuously worried about as well. What his thinking is hard to determine. I did spend time with a Russian community in Svalbard, which is a demilitarized, visa-free zone overseen by Norway. And those Russians were telling me that they wanted to carry on the way they were living now and not be under rule by Russia or Norway. So there's some discord there that isn't making a lot of sense. But at the end of the day, what Putin and what Trump want are mysteries to me, and I think a lot of other people.
Ken, we're all trying to join the dots between Ukraine and Venezuela and Greenland and perhaps what's happening in Africa in rare earth, mineral-rich countries like Congo. We're doing some shows on that too. Seems as if there's two readings of it. On the one hand, there's something new evolving in the world, a new 21st century great power architecture. On the other hand, we're really just going back to the 19th century, and rather than Britain and France and Germany, the new great powers are China, Russia, and the United States. In terms of your reading, particularly in the context of the polar, the Arctic area, is this just a return to history, or is it something new?
I think Timothy Snyder would suggest that history doesn't repeat itself, and that what we're seeing is new. And I would agree with him on that. Timothy Snyder being the famous,
who's been on the show, very critical of Putin in particular.
So that history can't really repeat itself. But in 2007, Putin launched a submarine that had several guests on board. They weren't necessarily naval personnel, and went down and planted a flag, a tricolor Russian flag, at the North Pole, at the bottom of the seabed. And the Canadian Prime Minister at the time was miffed and extraordinarily upset, as were many other Western nations, saying you can't go around planting flags anymore. This isn't the 19th century. You can't just claim different parts of the world. But now we're seeing that happening, at least in Ukraine, and some questionable behavior in Venezuela with that operation. But I think there is a shift in the world order, and I think there's a shift in the way that we cooperate with one another. But I have a tough time believing that the officials in Washington don't recognize how globalized our world is, and that one thing will affect another thing very easily, as we saw with the markets in response to Ukraine, the markets in response to Gaza, and that we can't just simply stay isolated. That's not a policy that will benefit us into the future.
It's interesting that you just mentioned the C word, Canada. We hadn't heard that word before. You talked about Greenland and Denmark, US, China, Russia. How does Canada come into this, given their enormous visibility, the accessibility to the Arctic, and the massive access to this new polar, well, not new, the old new polar area?
Well, the Canadians are dealing also, like the Danes, with reparations to the indigenous communities that they mistreated for so many years. And then Washington has been caustic with its approach to Canadian Arctic politics insofar as claiming that the Northwest Passage is free and navigable for everyone, that it's international water, whereas Canadian Ottawa believes that it's sovereign Canadian waterways. As far as Trump's rhetoric towards wanting to make Canada another state within the United States, we rely on Canada for some of our defense as well. I mean, they share an entire border that is primarily Arctic border, and without working to collaborate with them on shoring up the former DEW line or the Northern Defense Line for the protection of the country, we're missing out on an opportunity there. We're missing out on another nation that has a lot of capabilities and a lot of experience in the high north, and relegating them to some caricature of Trump's musings.
Are there international statesmen who are models for how to behave towards the Arctic? We did a show earlier this week with Jason Pack, the host of the Disorder podcast, who made the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney his Person of the Year in 2025. Is Carney a little bit more responsible, perhaps, than Trump when it comes to the Arctic?
I would point to Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, as someone who is a peacemaker, as it were, in navigating what the previous Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg had called the Achilles heel of NATO. And I keep referring to NATO because I see it also as just the collective of Western nations that have this interest in the high north. So I would look to him, and I think Trump's a fan of Mark, and he's certainly been doing a good job attempting to keep the tensions low between all the alliance members.
You seem to be one or two steps ahead of us, Ken. You already got your new book, Polar War. It's out this week. And on your website, you're advertising your next book. It's called One Click from Collapse. The author of Polar War turns his attention to the insecurity of our digital infrastructure. How do you keep ahead of everybody else?
By not getting paid enough, scratching at the seams. And I try to keep my attention focused on the things that keep cropping up in smaller news articles and trends that seem to quickly fall out of the news cycle. The interest in cyber warfare for me dates back to when I was reporting in Ukraine and some of the issues I was having with my digital communications and bizarre things that were happening with my laptop, and trying to go deep digital security to protect sources, to protect the people I love and care about, and all the information that I have in the digital sphere. So whether or not it's, whether or not I'm Cassandra, I don't know. I certainly hope not, but it is an interesting subject, and I'll be looking forward to report that book over the next several years.
Ken, as you know, I'm talking to you from Silicon Valley, where a lot of the visionaries, the multi-billionaires, for them, their Arctic is outer space. What does your reporting on polar war, what should it teach us and warn us about the colonial visions that guys like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have of colonizing space?
Well, I think from the Arctic perspective, it's a great launch pad into space. Right now, we don't have great satellite coverage over the northern region. Communications is very difficult. Starlink was certainly a boon to communications for Coast Guard vessels operating in the Arctic. I think ambitions towards space are a little bit premature, in part because there are so many issues on Earth, and I don't think I'm alone in that sentiment. But using the Arctic as a launch pad for more space exploration, giving that opportunity, both economic and well, primarily economic, to those communities in the far north, I think is great. Whether or not we need to fully devote our time and energies to colonizing Mars is beyond my purview at this point.
Maybe that can be your next book after our next book after One Click from Collapse will be One Rocket Ship from the Apocalypse. Finally, Ken, congratulations again on the book. Timing is magisterial, Polar War. But I wonder whether sometimes when you read the headlines, you're a little nostalgic for a time where you owned the Arctic, or at least you were one of the very few people spending time traveling, thinking, writing about the Arctic region, that somehow now everyone owns it. Is there? I mean, you obviously must be not pleased that there's going to be war in the Arctic, but pleased that it's become such a hot issue to launch your book. But as a writer and as an explorer, maybe not in the Arctic sense, but as someone who takes risks, do you sometimes wistfully think of a time when no one knew about the Arctic except Kenneth Rosen and the people who live there?
Arctic Dreaming is a great book. And reading that when I started out reporting Polar War made me wish for an Arctic that was more quiet and more beautiful and more accessible to everyone, for that very reason, for the silence, for the breathtaking views, and for the communities and creatures that live there that might not live there anymore. Am I nostalgic for it now? At this point, Andrew, I'm a little bit tired of the cold and the snow, and I could use a break. Looking out my window at 3 feet of snow and more coming down, I could use a beach right now. Well,
you deserve a beach, Kenneth Rosen. You're one of America's most intrepid, ambitious, talented journalists. Your new book, Polar War, is just out this week, and we'll definitely get you back on, Ken. I'd love to talk to you about One Click from Collapse, but so much happening in the world, and you seem, as I said, one step ahead of everyone else, so we need to keep up with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate it. Always a pleasure.